So you are very welcome to this session, and thanks for joining us this morning, especially after the bank holiday weekends. We have been running a whole series of workshops across the country, introductory workshops on climate action for the Arts Council over the last couple of months. And we are delighted to welcome you to this first training session, which is for strategically funded organizations and art centers who have to submit an environmental policy and action plan by next January as part of their funding conditions. So this is the very first of these training webinars, and we've designed them in particular for organizations who are starting out, who are earlier on and trying to figure out what they need to do. And we have designed 3 key sessions really that we recommend everybody does. Today is the first session, the next session on the 11th of June, which is about getting people on board, because you're not really going to get very far if you don't have people involved. And then the third session on the 18th of June, which is about developing action plans. So we really recommend that you do those 3 sessions as a package. I am just going to say a few words of introduction for our team who's with you today. So myself, Claire Buckley, I work for Julie's Bicycle based in London, and I have been working with many different shapes and sizes of cultural organizations over quite a long time on helping them to develop their environmental policies and plans and approaches. And we also have Catríona Fallon, founder of Green Arts Initiative in Ireland, and Catríona will be speaking a bit later. And we're also joined by Noreen Lucy from Native Events and Brecken, I didn't put your name on, who are here to support us over the course of today. Just a few practical things, just to let you know. We will be sharing the recording and the slides and the worksheets after this webinar, and they're going to be made available on the Arts Council's website. If you would like to have captions on, to have subtitles for the session today, there is a button in Zoom that you can use to show captions, but we will hopefully be speaking clearly. But you do have that option if you would like. We have a chat function if you want to add your name and your organization and say hello. If you want to add comments over the course of the session, please do. And we do also have a Q&A function. If you have specific questions, please do add them in the Q&A. And we have also made an additional half an hour available at the end from 12 to 12:30 for Q&A. And that part of the session will not be recorded. So just a couple of things to say what the aims of this session are. It's about getting started and getting on the way to developing your environmental approach, and in particular your environmental policy. And what we really hope is that you come out of this session today with a good idea about how to go about identifying what you should be focusing on in terms of environmental commitment and action. They have a good idea of what an environmental policy should cover and look like, and how to go about starting to develop that, and also thinking about who to involve along the way, because, as I said, change and action doesn't happen without people. I would also add that this session is really designed more for organizations who feel that they need the support and who are earlier on in the process of developing their approach. It's also a session which is for arts organizations, in particular venues, resource organizations and production companies. We have separate sessions in autumn, which are for festivals And we've planned that because of the timing, as most festival organizations are going to be in the thick of it for their festivals coming up over the summer. So what are we going to cover? We're going to cover a brief introduction to environmental policies. We're going to look at some key steps on the way to developing a good environmental policy. We're going to cover some examples and inspiration, hopefully, and some practical worksheets to help you along the way. But before we get into it, a question for you, and please do put your thoughts in the chats. And really, what is the first word or the first words which come into your head when you hear this term organizational environmental policy? We've been talking to lots of different organizations over the course of the last few months and have had a lot of questions. What is this policy? What should it be about? So really just feel free to share in the chats if you have, what are those first words which come into your head? Sustainability, that's a nice one. Thanks, Miguel. Okay. Teamwork. Okay, I think even those few comments are a very good reflection of what we've been hearing from people over the last few months. And hopefully this session today will help with the daunting nature of it and that feeling of overwhelm. Where do I start? But we can also see that there is also a positivity around the chance, opportunity to make positive changes and to bring. Well, thank you for adding your comments. So just introduction to environmental policies. And just to start, we thought it would be helpful to give a recap on what the Arts Council ask is to SFOs and arts centres. So basically the ask is to provide a document or a set of documents when you sign your funding agreement next January, which covers a policy. So that's really a top line statement of your environmental ambition and commitment, what it is you want to achieve, usually quite a short and succinct document. And the second thing is to submit a plan of action of how you're going to achieve what you've set out in terms of your commitments and goals, or how you're going to put your environmental values or principles into practice. And two reminders on this. There is no requirement to make your policy or action plan public, and the Arts Council is not planning to ask organisations to submit any environmental data or carbon footprints next year. This is something which may come at a later date, but there are no plans for this at the moment. So we thought it would be helpful also to kind of start with a bit of clarification around a policy and a plan. Many organizations kind of do it together, which is absolutely fine, whatever works for you. But the key thing is that the policy is that kind of broad top line statement about your ambition, what you want to achieve, what your commitments or goals are. And if you have particular principles, environmental principles, which you want to apply to what you're going to do. And a policy should be specific to the size, scale, and nature of your activity, which is very, very variable across different arts organizations. A policy should make clear who is accountable and who's responsible. And it should provide that broad framework for what you then go on to do in terms of environmental action and reporting. So top line statements. And then the plan of action is the plan of how are you actually going to achieve what you have set out in your policy. And it can be action to reduce your impacts. It might be around your buildings, about production, about practice. It could be action which is about informing or inspiring people through programming or through sector support activities. And it can also be a plan which is around environmental comms and engagement. As an example of the difference between a policy and a plan, just to refer to the Irish policy approach. So we have the Climate Action and Low Carbon Development Bill from 2021, and that sets out a broad objective around transitioning to a climate neutral, biodiversity rich society and economy, and sets also some specific targets around emissions reductions to 2030 and a broader aim of net zero by 2050. So even though it's quite a long policy document or a piece of legislation, it does set out that top line, what we want to achieve and why it's important. And it sets the framework for how that is going to be achieved in terms of an action plan. So there have been, there's longer term strategy, and then there have been 2 annual action plans, the most recent one for this year. They're super long documents, 420 pages, but they do actually also very nicely set out 6 priorities and then a whole set of actions around achieving those priorities. So we have tried to, I think, kind of highlight some of the key things to bear in mind when you are developing your environmental policy. And I think first and foremost is make it your own, make it specific and relevant to your organization, who you are, what you do, who you do it with, and where you do it. And don't make it something which is so generic that it could be just copied and pasted and applied to any organization. Make it your own. The second thing we would say is be honest and credible about what you want to achieve. If you're really just starting out and you're not sure at all, then, focus on laying the foundation, laying the groundwork and taking some key initial steps. If you're a bit further ahead, you might have a different level of ambition, but really don't make unrealistic claims or commitments that you don't feel you can live up to. The third thing that we would say to do is make it succinct, make it short, and make it clear. Just think you want to communicate to people what you want to achieve, what is your policy, and make it easy for people to understand. And definitely don't write it as a big, long government style policy type document and 420 pages, as in the case of the Irish government. So really think about, can somebody quickly read it and get a sense of what you're about and what your environmental priorities are. The next thing that we would say is develop your policy as a team effort. Don't just go and sit in a corner and write it on your own. And following on from that, make sure that it is signed off at whatever the appropriate level is in your organization, whether you are big or small. Don't just kind of come out with a document that your CEO or director or your board wasn't even aware of. Make sure that they understand it and that they are able to support it and that they have buy-in for it. And the next do is to document your policy in some way and to share it in a way so people know where to find it, as opposed to having like some random Word document that you've just written up that nobody knows where it is and nobody can find it. And the final point is also, it's a policy document. It's not meant to change all the time. It's setting out some broad parameters, but do take a look at it every few years to see, is it still relevant? Do we need to update it? It's not something that should be changing every few months or even every year. You can change, you can do annual action plans, for example, but the policy should be that broad framework documents. And I think over the course of the last few months, the organizations we've been speaking to actually quite a lot have some kinds of commitments and even quite a clear policy, but it's not something that they have formalized or that they have shared. So even if you don't have a policy document, doesn't mean you have a good policy. But in this case, what the Arts Council wants to see is some evidence of that. And having something formalized, something written down is really a way for you to communicate and to share and to get people to come on board for teamwork, for positive change as well. I think another thing which which can also happen is that organizations can have quite strong environmental policies, but it's been very much dependent on one person, and it's been driven by their commitment and enthusiasm. And what can happen is if it's not a more kind of formal, shared, approved document, that if that person who's been the key driving force behind it leaves the organization, that policy might not actually continue. So I think that point, and that is something we will be following up in the next session as well, that getting people on board and kind of getting it as more teamwork and more of a shared approach is really important. So we have a little question for you. Noreen, if you could launch that poll question. And we just wanted to get a sense from you of where you think you are in terms of your organizational environmental policy. Are you just starting to think about it, working on it, have a clear set of commitments and priorities, but not written down? You have something, but you think it's not great. You have something which is documented and has a senior or sign off on the appropriate level, or maybe somewhere in between, in the middle of those.
So we have 44% just starting to think about it and 40% working on it. 4% have a clear set of commitments and priorities, and 12% have a policy, but it's not great.
Okay, that sounds good. I think you're in the right place, and I think that is something that we've also been hearing from people over the last few months. Hopefully today is going to help you further along the way. We've seen one of the comments in the chat already about how it can feel daunting and overwhelming. And what we are going to go through is what are the different things to think about and the different steps to take in developing that policy. And I think the first thing that we would say, and this is really important, every organization is different and there is not a one size fits all approach. We know people are like, just tell us what to do, give us a list. But I think what's really important is start at the beginning and define your policy, your commitments based on who you are, where you are, what you do, who you do it with, what you value and what you want to change. Situate what your environmental approach is in the context of that, and that will really help you to get a clearer connection between what you do and where environmental action fits in with that. The second thing that we would say is be clear on why it matters. Of course, it might matter because it's a policy, a funding condition from the Arts Council, but within your policy, have some kind of statement about why this is important. We are in a climate emergency. this is affecting us in our daily lives, from food and farming to weather events. It's also having an impact on cultural activity. It's really important to people to, so many of the organizations we have spoken to have said we want to do more. This is important to the people who work with us, and the people, our audiences, our communities. I think actually a nice example from the Arts Council's own policy, which hasn't been published yet, but basically they went through a process and they're like, okay, we have a requirement as an arm's length body, as a public sector body, to do something in line with government policy, number one. Secondly, we've done a whole process of consultation. We know this is important to many people and organizations within the arts. And thirdly, there is an opportunity for us as the Arts Council to support the sector in really playing an important role within positive change and climate action. So have a think, why is this important to your organization in particular? I think very often when organizations are starting out with developing a policy, they kind of dive into things of, okay, we can do this, this, and this, but really do take a step back and have a think about the different ways in which you can make a positive difference. Absolutely, you need to be addressing your impacts, and whatever that will depend on who you are and what you do. It might be about saving energy, it might be about materials, it might be about making more space for nature. There's different practical ways that you can make a difference. But of course, as arts organizations, there's so many opportunities for informing and inspiring change as well, raising awareness, bringing environmental themes into programming, into what you do if you're a resource organization to support the organizations or artists you work with. And that is, absolutely crucial and central to what the arts are about. And there may also be ways in which you can make a positive difference more widely through working with your peers, through collaboration, through pushing for particular solutions or change. So when you're doing your policy, do look at practical action, but do take a step back and think, okay, where are the different ways we can make a difference given what we are about? Another kind of key piece of advice we would say is don't get carbon tunnel vision. Yes, carbon emissions are really important, and there are a lot of things we can do around energy and transport and food, for example, but do also see the bigger picture, what we are doing in terms of depleting resources, in terms of of pollution, in terms of water and nature. Do kind of take that step back and have a look, and Catríona will be going through this as well, and think, where are those key areas of impact? What should we be focusing on? And in particular, for a lot of arts organizations, you will not find it that easy to always put everything in terms of carbon emissions, and there are other ways that you can make a difference that can't necessarily be put into a neat carbon metric. When developing your policy, remember change doesn't happen without people. And from the beginning, think about who needs to be involved in the process and how they can be involved. How can you bring people together to come up with a collective understanding and commitments? Whose support and buy-in do you need in particular? Who needs to be actively involved? And who should be thinking about in terms of broader communication and engagement. This is just an example in terms of thinking about who you are working with and for, and who you should be kind of thinking about within your policy and your environmental approach. you will have a whole range of stakeholders, but you can also have a think about, within those groups, who has a high level of interest, a high level of influence, or who has a lower level of interest and influence, and try and think about who your stakeholders are and your engagement approach, which is tailored to meet the needs of those different stakeholders. So that is a few kind of key things to think about when you're starting to develop your environmental policy. And I am going to hand over to Catríona now, who is going to talk through in a bit more detail about taking that step back, understanding who you are and what you do, and what the relevant environmental issues are.
So hopefully you can all see the screen. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about activities and impacts. And really, to create an effective climate change and environmental policy, you need to have some understanding of what your impacts are. Achieving a better understanding will be part of that policy, but it would be difficult to create an initial policy without having some basic information about the impacts. For those who've already created policies or who are working on them, you probably already have a good grasp of those impacts, but others may feel they just have a sort of broad understanding and perhaps will categorize those impacts, in terms of energy, in terms of transport, travel, accommodation, and so on. But an approach which I would commend to you all is to begin with what you understand best, and that's really your own activities. So as arts organizations, you have specific activities that will vary from one organization to another and from one kind of organization to another. And if you list your activities as an organization, something that you're all keenly aware of because it's what you do every day, I would suggest that it's easier to map your impacts by starting from there. So I thought maybe to use a few examples. So if, for example, you were a production company, whether that's a dance company or whether it's a theatre making company, you would have a range of activities. And these are a few that I'm suggesting, but ideally, this is a kind of exercise that you sit down and do as a staff team, as a group together with as many of your stakeholders as you can manage. Could be done online quite easily. So these are some that I'm suggesting. There may be others that I haven't thought of. But for example, a production company will create, tech, rehearse a new production. They will tour productions nationally, almost certainly. Some production companies will tour productions internationally. There can be quite a lot of networking involved. If you're a production company, you might go to visit other theatre companies or dance companies. You might travel to festivals abroad. You might travel to meet up with directors or choreographers or dramaturgs. So that whole networking is very important. Operations and admin is a kind of small part of what most production companies do because most of them are involved or are based in probably a small office in a shared building. So that's going to be a smaller part, but nonetheless worth considering. And then quite a lot of production companies would deliver some kind of training, whether that's to the sector or wider training to the general public. So those are a range of the kinds of activities that a production company might have. And if we just picked one activity and mapped its impacts, the idea would be that this is something that you could do yourselves. Once you've identified those impacts, that you could then identify the activities, you then map the impacts. So for example, creating a new production, the images from a show called Embargo by Deirdre Keenahan, with permission from Fishamble, the new play company. So if we were to map the impacts of creating that new production, so not so much running it or touring, but just the initial creation of that show, there would be impacts across electricity, energy in terms of electricity, in terms of heating, travel and transport, accommodation, materials and waste, and then other things like catering, digital, printing, water. And again, you might sort of refine those impacts depending on your activities and what kind of an organization you are. And then to give some examples of what some of those impacts might be in those different areas. So for example, you'll use stage lamps during a tech rehearsal or a dress rehearsal. You'll use building lighting when you're maybe rehearsing on stage, or if you're rehearsing in an alternative space, you'll be using lighting. You'll be deciding at this point in the creation of production what kind of a lighting rig you're going to have, whether you're going to use more tungsten or more LED, and what the options are, because obviously the amount of lamps that you use in the rig and the kinds of lamps you use will have a bearing on your electricity usage further down the line. Heating, kind of a smaller thing here at this stage, really just reheating rehearsal rooms and spaces, and maybe rooms where you're having concept or development or production meetings. In terms of travel and transport, you probably would be bringing creative the creative team together, the writers, directors, performers, designers, and so on. Quite a lot of that now does happen online. And obviously the bigger element in terms of travel and transport really is if you're going to tour a production. And once you're moving that production and the performers and the tech crew around the country, you have much bigger impacts there. But there would be a certain amount of transport of materials for set, costumes, and props. And in many cases in Ireland, the set is usually manufactured somewhere else. The English model is slightly different. We don't have too many theatres that are large enough to create productions and create the set on site. So they're generally transported elsewhere, or created elsewhere and transported. In terms of accommodation, you may have some accommodation requirements around the rehearsal period, again, for that creative team that are coming, but that would be much more significant if you're going on tour. In terms of materials, you'll be looking at materials for set, costumes and props, waste, the kind of general day-to-day waste from bringing people together in rehearsal room can be quite significant. And then in terms of catering, food and drink for the creative team, a certain amount of online meetings, emails in terms of digital, printing of scripts, a very small part, and the designing of marketing materials and website updates, that's all part of the digital impact. And if we pick a second example, so looking at a visual arts gallery, so there are some elements that are not similar in that a visual arts gallery will create and install new exhibitions. They would potentially tour those exhibitions nationally and even in some cases internationally. Operations, maintenance and admin is a much bigger chunk for a visual arts gallery because it's a building that's generally open to the public. It's a building that has to be heated. If there are artworks, it has to be heated to certain temperatures at all times. There'll be lighting, there'll be maintenance and so on. So much bigger impacts there than there would be for your production company in terms of the ongoing operations. And a lot of visual arts spaces and galleries will deliver workshops, tours of exhibitions, training either for the sector or for the general public. And networking, not dissimilar to the example of a production company. Those involved certainly for bigger galleries and where they have the opportunity, you might be visiting exhibitions elsewhere, meeting up with artists, traveling abroad to see potential exhibitions, touring to your gallery and so on. And finally, hospitality and catering. For some of the larger galleries, they may even have cafes on there, included within the site. But even for smaller galleries, it may be necessary to provide catering for exhibition launches and openings. And finally, just the ongoing hosting of an exhibition, a big impact there would be particularly around lighting and heating. So again, let's just to pick one activity and map those impacts across the range of areas. Electricity, heating, transport, it's very similar to the previous example. And so gallery lighting, installing that gallery lighting as part of the installation is going to be a big thing. Certain use of machinery and equipment during installation, powering of projectors, screens and other equipment. Obviously, that becomes much more significant once the exhibition is up and running. And that can be a big part, especially with modern contemporary installation practices and so on. There can be a lot of technical equipment involved. Heating is a critical thing for anything to do with the visual arts, especially if you've borrowed works or the works are on loan. If they are older works, maintaining a particular temperature is critical. And that would apply whether those artworks are in storage or whether the building is closed or whether the exhibition is opening. So that's really a big requirement for visual arts. Travel and transport, again, bringing a creative team together, whether it be artists, curators, technical crew. The biggest part really at this stage of creating an exhibition is around transport of artworks because they have to be very carefully packaged. They have to be, if they're being transported from abroad, you're looking at either probably freight by ferry. So that's a big impact at this stage. And a lot of packaging materials traditionally would have been used as well. So transport of any additional equipment and any travel for anyone involved in outreach and education. In terms of accommodation, you may have, the artist would visit probably over a period of time, looking at spaces, making agreements with curators. The curator might be traveling, materials and equipment. Quite a lot of exhibitions would involve, additions or modifications to gallery spaces. So you could be putting up false walls, plinths, shelving and so on. New equipment around audio and projection, screen might be needed. And then waste, particularly around packaging. And I know when we were doing the discovery phase, we talked to a couple of galleries who've made some really interesting innovations around using reusable packaging, sort of packaging cases that can be reused indefinitely. And that's a really wonderful innovation to see, because there's so much waste, particularly in terms of bubble wrap, for the way artworks have been transported up to now. The other impacts that you might look at there would be, again, catering, digital printing, exhibition launch and hospitality, online promotion and listings, signage, display boards. All of that is a big issue for gallery spaces, because traditionally they would have used vinyl and other really not very nice materials. So that's one big impact from this creation of an installation of an exhibition. Final example we're just going to look at is a resource-based resource organisation. And we're looking maybe at the example of a membership organisation. So, for example, Visual Artists Ireland is a membership organisation. Theatre Forum as well as Performing Arts Ireland is another one. ISACS, the Association for Street Arts and Circus. So all of those are membership organisations, quite different to the two previous examples we looked at. They would provide a lot of information online. So digitally, they're going to have certain impacts. They do a lot of work around networking, whether that's advocacy, lobbying, and so on. That could be internationally, that could be nationally. They organise a lot of events online. So events, whether that's disseminating information or whether that's bringing people together to collaborate. And they organise a certain amount of in-person events. That would be rarer in the case of resource-based organisations or resource organisations. And for example, Performing Arts Ireland had their annual gathering in Sligo last week. So that has quite a significant impact, but it's not something that happens very often. Operations, maintenance and admin tends to be very small for these kinds of organisations. They tend to be based in an office, usually in a shared building. So it's not a key concern, but certainly worth looking at. If they were to organise an online event, just one example, the impacts of that are really the digital impacts. And when we're talking about digital, we're largely talking about electricity usage, because everything that we do digitally uses electricity, and that is where the sort of the carbon footprint, if you like, of that particular impact is. But it's still significantly better than the emissions from a lot of people traveling. You know, we tend to think of the emissions of travel, but think also if people are driving, there's a lot of very nasty pollution that comes from wear and tear from tires and so on. So it's not just the actual fuel itself that's important. So this is an example of Theatre Forum, Performing Arts Forum, as they're now called, their event in Sligo last week. A once a year event, but significant impacts across electricity, heating. I'm not going to go into too many details here, but obviously panelists and presenters have to be brought, accommodated and fed. There's a lot of catering that goes on. There's quite a lot of digital goes on. Much less printing and material and merchandise than there would have been traditionally. All those people have to be heated and they're in buildings that are using electricity and so on. So kind of impacts across the board, really. So I would suggest that once you have kind of clarified within your organization that you've identified what your activities are, mapped their impacts, the next step would be to see, really, what can you control, what you can influence, and what's of concern. And for those of you who are at the regional roadshows, you're familiar with this, Stephen Covey's control, influence and concern model. But I think it's a really useful way when people do feel overwhelmed by what can they do. Focus on what you can control, then think about what you can influence, and finally, what's of concern. And to maybe, how does that apply in the creation of your climate change and environmental policy? So you're going to commit as part of that policy to understanding what your impacts are. And you're probably going to commit to measuring the ones you have control over. It's going to be very difficult to measure the ones you don't have control over. You might commit to trying to influence others, where you have even if you don't have control over that, and then know what is of concern. And I've just picked an example of travel. So, for example, you might create a travel policy of your own team, which prioritizes public transport for business travel. You're paying for that. So, as an organization, you have some control over that. And an example might be in that policy that you would say that you do not reimburse for internal flights. So if someone flew from Dublin to Kerry, that they won't be reimbursed for that. And again, you have control over that because you are paying for that travel. You could invite artists, again, this is a slightly softer area. You could invite artists maybe traveling from the UK to take part of their journey by land and sea. So it's kind of a mixture of control and influence. You are paying for that travel. You don't want to force anybody. It may not be convenient for them, but you might suggest it as an option so you can influence them, and you're paying for it. You could invite your audiences to travel to your event by public transport. You have no control over them. That was the case with the Performing Arts Forum, where people were encouraged, and with a lot of the events that we have run and events that Culture Ireland run. So you have no control over it, but your influence has, and I've said this before, travel is an area where everybody in the arts has a fantastic potential to influence that massive big area of travel. And finally, in terms of, what's of concern, you could make representations to your local authority to improve, for example, cycling and cycleways and provide secure bike parking. So you have no control over that. You probably have very little influence, but you can still indicate that it's of concern to you as an organisation.
So for the last part of the recorded session, we've got some tips and some examples. We kept the examples till the end. So first of all, there is no one recipe for developing an environmental policy, but there are a few things that you should really cover and think about covering in that policy. Have some kind of introduction or a scene setting about your organization and what you're about and why, in this context, climate and environmental action matters to you as an organization. What is it? What are your key environmental aims or commitments? What do you most want to change? What are your key priorities, given who you are, what you do, and who you do with? And thinking about those different areas of impact which you've identified. You might also want to include some principles. What principles are you underpinning your approach? You should definitely make clear who's accountable and responsible for the policy, and then make some reference to plans for actually putting the policy into practice. So that's kind of a few kind of key things that we would suggest you cover in your policy. We've got some examples. We have deliberately only included one Irish example. We are pulling together some Irish examples, but I think we have a nice set across different types of activities. The example from Cushcame, I think, is very short and succinct, but very clear, and puts into, explains who they are and what environmental action means for them, identifies their priorities, and it's clear that it has been approved and signed off on the appropriate level of the organization. It's a really nice, succinct example. This example is from Fallon Cymru, so Fallon Wales, as a sector support body or similar to resource organization. And they have made their policy public on their website. Again, it sets out who they are and what they're about and how, what environmental sustainability means for them in that context. And then it lays out some 4 key areas, 4 key priorities where they are focusing in on environmental action in different ways, from their own impacts as an organization to the work that they do with the green sector in Wales. And then it lists the key areas that its key commitments and what it is focusing on in terms of priorities and impacts. And it also refers to a few key principles that are underpinning its approach. So it's, I think, a nice, clear, succinct example, which is hopefully quite relevant for resource organizations and membership organizations. This example is from an art centre in Lewes in southern England, Depot Lewes. They have developed their environmental policy over quite a long time. It's very succinct in the introduction. They refer to the Sustainable Development Goals, and they also provide an overview of their key areas, what they are focusing on with their environmental approach, and then they provide a bit more information within each area on what that actually means in practice. And this example is from Walk the Plank, which is a production company based in Manchester. Again, this is available on their website. They have a high level of ambition and some clear targets around carbon literacy and net zero and carbon positive even. They've set out some key key principles that they're applying to their approach. They've put it in the context, they put their actions in the context of what they do and what they're about as a production company and who they work with. They've outlined their impacts and on the basis of that, what kind of action they're going to take. And then they've also explained how they're going to implement that, in particular, who is involved in that. So again, they've developed their policy and approach over quite a few years already. But I think, again, it's clear and really specific and meaningful to who they are and what they do. So they are some examples. We're looking forward to adding lots more wonderful examples over time. In terms of some more practical worksheets that we will share after the webinar as well. We have been asked by quite a few organizations for some kind of template or worksheets. It is really important to make your policy your own, to make it relevant and meaningful to you and what you do. But we have got a few key pointers for things to go through when you're in the process of trying to pull together your environmental policy, starting with that kind of intro on key information about your organization, why this matters to you, and then kind of going through what those kind of key priorities and key commitments are relating to what your impacts are and what your activities are as well. And then the other key area is around who is accountable and who is responsible. And you may want to add in some principles which are underlying your approach, and just given some examples there. So we'll make that available along with the slides and the webinar recording. Catríona, do you want to say just a few words about this?
Yeah, this is just maybe to make it a little bit easier. If you were going to take that approach where you identify your activities and then map the impacts of those. So it's a worksheet that I've created. It's probably a little bit rustic, but it allows you to, you can fill it in online, which is the whole purpose of it. And there's a couple of pages across the different areas of impact. So I'm hoping that it will sort of clarify things for you, especially if you're working with a group of people within your team.
Thanks, Catríona. So I think we have really kind of gone through the key steps in how to start thinking about developing your environmental policy, what you need to think about, getting a sense of what you should be focusing on, what your priorities should be, thinking about who you need to involve in that process. As I said, we'll be focusing on that in particular in the next session next week. We have also, I'm just going to give you an overview of the next training webinars, which hopefully, as I said, the first three we really recommend as a nice kind of set to help you on the way. And then the ones which follow that are more optional in terms of what you're doing and what areas of impact and action you want to focus on. So next Tuesday, same time, we have this session which is looking at getting people on board and involving people in change. The following Tuesday on the 18th of June at the earlier time of 10 a.m. is a session on developing action plans. And that one is tailored to more public-facing buildings such as venues and art centres and galleries, theatres, and buildings which are bigger energy users. And also then on the 18th of June in the afternoon, we have this similar topic around developing action plans, but that is tailored to office-based organizations and production companies. So those with today's session and the session on the 11th and the 18th, that is kind of the core sessions we really recommend that you join. Then following on from that, from the end of June, we have a session which is going to go into a bit more detail about measuring your environmental impacts and doing carbon footprinting. On the 2nd of July, a session focused on what you can do around nature and biodiversity. And on the 9th of July, focused on buildings energy use. The 16th of July will focus on materials and procurement. And then in October, the date for that one is yet to be confirmed, but there'll be a session around influencing change. So, you know, what are the opportunities to bring this into your learning and outreach activities, your collections, your exhibitions, your programming, the work that you do to support artists or member organizations. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, there is a separate set of webinars specifically designed for festivals, and festivals by their temporary nature, their outdoor nature, or the way that they are hosted and held in different indoor venues, they will have a very specific few areas where they can make positive environmental change happen. So that is bringing us to the end of the recorded session. We hope that you have found it useful and helpful.